The first time Adrian Vale killed me, he looked like he was about to apologize. That was the thought in my head when I opened my eyes and found myself kneeling in the middle of Asteria's grand square, surrounded by thousands of people who apparently had nothing better to do than watch my public downfall. Silver banners snapped in the cold morning wind. Bells rang from the academy towers. Somewhere behind me, a man shouted that justice had finally arrived, which felt unnecessarily dramatic considering I had only been conscious for 6 seconds. Then I looked up. Adrian stood 10 feet away in ceremonial armor, one hand resting on the hilt of a polished sword. He was exactly as the novel had described him: tall, pale, dark-haired, painfully handsome, and emotionally available only during national emergencies. His gray eyes met mine, and for one strange second, the entire square went silent. Not actually silent, of course. People were still cheering. Someone was selling roasted almonds near the fountain. But inside me, everything stopped. I knew this scene. I had read it at 2 in the morning while eating cold pizza and complaining online about lazy character development. Logan Reed, the spoiled minor villain, was condemned after betraying the heroes. Adrian carried out the sentence. The story moved on. Nobody missed him. The problem was that I was Logan Reed now, and I suddenly had several strong opinions about being forgotten. Adrian stepped closer. There was no anger in his face. That made it worse. He looked tired, regretful, almost. His voice was low when he said my name, as if it belonged to someone he had once known. The sword lifted, catching the pale light, and my heart slammed against my ribs. I wanted to explain that there had been a mistake. I wanted to tell him I was not this world's Logan, that I had never betrayed anyone, and that my greatest crime back home was stealing my roommate's labeled yogurt. But the words would not come. Adrian's expression changed, just slightly. His fingers tightened around the hilt, and I saw something impossible in his eyes. Recognition. Grief. Then the world flashed white. I woke with a gasp in a 4-poster bed. Sunlight spilling across blue curtains. My hands flew to my neck. No crowd. No armor. No bells. Just a quiet dorm room and a calendar on the wall marking the first day of term at Asteria Academy. 3 years before Logan Reed's scheduled death. I stumbled to the mirror. The face staring back was younger, softer, and definitely belonged to the character everyone hated. I laughed once, because apparently panic had broken something important in my brain. Fine. I knew the plot. I knew every disaster, betrayal, and badly timed confession. Survival would be simple. Avoid the heroes. Ignore the heroine. Stay invisible. I leaned closer to the mirror, ready to congratulate myself on this flawless plan, and froze. Across my throat was a thin silver scar, exactly where Adrian's sword had touched me in a future that had not happened yet. The first rule of surviving a fantasy novel was surprisingly simple. Do not make eye contact with the main characters. I repeated that to myself while buttoning the dark Navy Academy uniform that Logan Reed apparently wore with far more confidence than I currently possessed. The silver scar across my throat had not disappeared. Every time I caught my reflection, it shimmered faintly beneath the morning light, like the future refusing to let go. I tugged my collar a little higher and pointed a finger at the mirror. You are invisible now, I whispered. You are background scenery. You are decorative wallpaper with decent grades. The mirror looked unconvinced. 20 minutes later, I was walking through Asteria Academy with my head down, determined to avoid every major event I remembered from the novel. Students laughed beneath flowering trees. Professors floated enchanted books through the air, and glowing birds circled the marble towers as if magic had replaced ordinary pigeons. It was beautiful. It was also a giant collection of places where terrible things happened to supporting characters. According to the original story, Adrian Vale would arrive through the east courtyard at exactly 8:30. Logan was supposed to crash into him, spill a stack of books, start an argument, and accidentally begin a rivalry that ended very badly. 3 years later, I checked the clock tower. 8:28. Perfect. I immediately turned around and walked toward the West Garden. I could practically hear Destiny filing a complaint. The path was quiet, lined with crystal flowers that chimed softly whenever the breeze touched them. I smiled for the first time since waking up. Maybe changing the story really was this easy. Then the air cracked with a sound like glass breaking underwater. Every flower around me folded shut at once. The temperature dropped so quickly that I could see my breath. A black ripple spread across the stone walkway, twisting into a circular tear surrounded by flickering blue light. I recognized it instantly. A shadow breach. It was supposed to appear next month during a combat lesson, not 5 minutes after breakfast. That is definitely not according to the schedule, I muttered, before I could decide whether hiding behind a conveniently shaped bush counted as courage. A first-year student wandered around the corner carrying 3 oversized spell books that completely blocked his view. He walked straight toward the unstable portal, humming happily to himself. My brain reminded me that staying alive required avoiding trouble. My legs completely ignored that advice. I lunged forward, grabbed the younger student by the sleeve, and pulled him backward just as the ground beneath his feet exploded into swirling darkness. His books scattered across the path. He stared at me with wide eyes. "Thank you," he breathed. I barely heard him. Someone else had entered the courtyard behind us. Heavy boots stopped a few yards away. I did not need to turn around to know who it was. Every instinct I had screamed the same name. Adrian Vale. I kept my eyes on the frightened student. "Run," I said quietly. He did not argue. He gathered his books and disappeared between the trees. Good. One person was safe. Now I only had one problem left. I slowly looked over my shoulder. Adrian stood perfectly still, watching me with an unreadable expression. At his feet, resting on the polished stone, lay the small silver academy crest that had fallen from my jacket when I pulled the boy to safety. If there was one universal truth about fictional heroes, it was that they always looked dramatically composed while completely ruining someone else's day. Adrian Vale bent down, without saying a word, and picked up the silver academy crest that had fallen from my uniform. He turned it over once between his fingers, sunlight gliding across the engraved name before his gray eyes lifted back to mine. I resisted the overwhelming urge to sprint into the nearest fountain and pretend I was an unusually athletic fish. "You dropped this," he said. His voice was calm, steady, and somehow even more intimidating because he was being polite. I stepped forward just enough to accept the crest without letting our hands touch. "Thank you," I answered, keeping my eyes respectfully somewhere around the 3rd button of his uniform jacket. Looking directly at the future strongest hero in the kingdom felt like tempting fate. Adrian did not leave. That was unfortunate. According to the novel, he was supposed to be extremely busy ignoring everyone except important plot points. Instead, he studied me with quiet curiosity. "You knew the breach would appear," he finally said. It was not a question. My heart skipped so hard that I briefly considered filing a complaint with my own nervous system. "I guessed," I replied a little too quickly. "Lucky guess." One of his eyebrows lifted by approximately half an inch. Somehow that tiny movement felt more dangerous than an entire army. "There has never been a shadow breach in this courtyard," he said. "Then I should probably buy a lottery ticket," I answered before my brain could stop my mouth. Wonderful. I had apparently chosen sarcasm as my final survival strategy. To my surprise, the corner of Adrian's mouth almost moved. It was not exactly a smile, but it looked suspiciously like one considering his legendary reputation for emotional restraint. Before either of us could continue the conversation, a sharp bell echoed across the academy grounds. Students hurried toward the central hall. Adrian glanced toward the tower, then back at me. "Report the incident to the faculty," he said. "Someone will investigate." I nodded so enthusiastically that I nearly dropped my crest again. "Absolutely. Excellent idea." I was actually just on my way to do exactly that, which was technically true now that he had suggested it. Adrian walked past me without another word, his dark cape catching the breeze as he disappeared beneath the marble archway. I waited exactly 5 seconds before releasing the breath I had apparently been holding since breakfast. "Still alive?" I whispered to myself. Barely, but alive. Unfortunately, the universe had clearly mistaken survival for permission to become even stranger. By lunchtime, the entire academy was buzzing with rumors about the mysterious student who had predicted a shadow breach. Some claimed an upperclassman had sensed unstable magic. Others insisted a visiting royal magician had secretly intervened. One particularly creative rumor suggested a ghost librarian had saved the first-year student. I strongly supported the ghost theory because ghosts did not have to attend afternoon lectures. I slipped into the back row of magical history, hoping to disappear among 200 students and one exceptionally boring professor. That plan lasted approximately 40 seconds. The classroom door opened, and Ethan Blake walked inside carrying a stack of healing manuals almost taller than himself. In the original novel, Ethan was gentle, endlessly kind, and completely impossible to dislike. He paused near my desk, looked directly at me with warm amber eyes, and frowned ever so slightly. "This is going to sound strange," he said with an apologetic smile, "but I feel like I have been looking for you for a very long time, even though I am certain we have never met before." The room suddenly felt much quieter than it should have, and somewhere deep inside my chest, the silver scar across my throat tingled with cold that did not belong to this timeline. The rest of the afternoon refused to return to normal, which was incredibly rude considering I had worked so hard to become forgettable. Ethan Blake smiled as though he had merely asked whether the seat beside me was available instead of casually suggesting that my existence had wandered into his dreams. The other students laughed, assuming he was joking. I laughed too, mostly because the alternative involved screaming into a history textbook. "We have definitely never met," I said carefully. "I would remember." Ethan tilted his head with the kind of gentle curiosity that made people immediately trust him. "That is what makes it strange," he replied. "I know we have not met, but every time I looked at you just now, it felt like I was remembering someone I lost." A strange silence settled between us before the professor loudly cleared his throat and began discussing the founding of the kingdom. Ethan offered an apologetic smile and took an empty seat across the aisle, but I noticed something that made the back of my neck prickle. Every few minutes, he glanced in my direction with the same quiet expression, as though he was trying to solve a puzzle that had followed him into the classroom. By the time the lecture ended, I escaped so quickly that I nearly walked into a floating suit of enchanted armor. "Sorry," I muttered to the armor. It saluted me anyway. My life had become so unusual that apologizing to magical furniture no longer ranked in the top 5 weirdest moments of the day. I headed toward the Academy Library because almost nobody voluntarily visited 6 floors of ancient books on the first week of classes. The library smelled like cedar shelves, old parchment, and rain drifting through open stained glass windows. It was peaceful, safe. Fictional heroes usually preferred training grounds, royal meetings, or dramatic rooftops. Libraries belonged to overworked scholars and people hiding from responsibility. In other words, they belonged to me. I wandered through endless shelves until I found the section devoted to prophetic history. In the novel, this room contained several restricted volumes that only appeared under unusual circumstances. I did not expect anything to happen. Naturally, that was when a dusty blue book slipped from the shelf all by itself and landed neatly at my feet. "That is not concerning at all," I whispered. The cover had no title. When I opened it, the pages were completely blank except for one sentence slowly writing itself in shimmering silver ink. "The anchor has returned. The heroes are beginning to remember." I stared at the words until they faded as if they had never existed. Before I could convince myself that stress had finally broken my imagination, footsteps echoed softly through the aisle. I snapped the book shut and looked up. Adrian stood at one end of the shelves, while another figure entered from the opposite side. Mason Cole, the Academy's legendary swordsman, rested a practice blade across one shoulder with an easy grin that contrasted completely with Adrian's quiet seriousness. Mason stopped walking the moment he noticed me. His smile slowly disappeared. "This is going to sound ridiculous," he admitted with an embarrassed laugh. "But have we trained together before?" My heart dropped. In the original story, Mason and Logan did not even speak until the second year. Before I could answer, another voice drifted from behind the shelves. "Interesting," Julian Cross said as he stepped into view, a glowing spell book floating beside him. His sharp blue eyes remained fixed on me with unsettling focus. 3 people sensing the same impossible familiarity on the same day cannot be a coincidence. For future heroes now stood within a few feet of me, each wearing a different expression, but all looking at me as though they had been searching for someone they could not remember. And for the first time since waking inside this world, I began to wonder if changing the story had never really been my choice at all. 4 future heroes standing in the same library aisle should have been impossible. For future heroes staring at me like I was the answer to a question none of them could remember was somehow even worse. My survival plan had officially collapsed before making it through the first day of classes. "I think you have the wrong person," I said, forcing a smile that probably looked more like someone quietly accepting an unfortunate insurance policy. "I am just Logan." The words sounded painfully ordinary, exactly how I wanted them to sound. Julian cross-folded his arms, his floating spell book slowly circling above one shoulder like it was listening to the conversation. His bright blue eyes never left my face. "That is precisely the problem," he said thoughtfully. "Everything about you feels ordinary, but every instinct I have says that cannot possibly be true." I laughed once. It came out higher than expected. "Your instincts should probably take the afternoon off." Mason let out a soft chuckle, though he still looked puzzled. Ethan seemed almost guilty for making me uncomfortable, while Adrian remained completely silent. Somehow his silence filled more space than everyone else's words combined. The library clock chimed 4 times, breaking the strange tension. Students began filing into the reading hall around us, filling the room with quiet conversations and rustling pages. For a brief moment, I thought normal life might finally rescue me. Then the academy lights flickered. Every enchanted crystal hanging from the ceiling dimmed at exactly the same time. A cold breeze drifted through the library despite every window being closed. The floating candles froze in midair. Julian looked upward immediately. "Magic fluctuation," he murmured. "Again," Ethan whispered. Before anyone could react, dozens of books slid from nearby shelves at once. They did not fall. They hovered several inches above the floor, their pages flipping rapidly without a single hand touching them. The sound was like hundreds of whispered conversations happening at once. Students gasped and hurried toward the exits while librarians tried to calm everyone without much success. My stomach tightened because I remembered this event far too well. Except it was supposed to happen during winter, almost 6 months from now. "Everyone should leave," I said before thinking. Adrian turned toward me instantly. "Why?" My mouth opened before my brain approved the decision. "Because in about 30 seconds. The sentence stopped halfway as realization hit me. I had almost revealed knowledge that Logan should never possess. Adrian watched me carefully. "In about 30 seconds what?" My pulse hammered in my ears. Think faster." "The ceiling wards," I improvised. "They are unstable." Julian frowned. "There are no reports suggesting." A loud ringing echoed through the library. Thin silver lines spread across the enchanted ceiling, like light racing beneath frozen glass. Every magical scholar in the room looked up at once. Julian's sentence quietly disappeared. Adrian moved without hesitation. "Everyone outside," he ordered. His calm voice carried through the room more effectively than panic ever could. Students hurried toward the doors while professors reinforced the glowing barriers overhead. Within moments, the strange magical pressure faded. The floating books gently settled back onto their shelves, and the library returned to peaceful silence as though nothing unusual had happened. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. Finally, Mason looked at me with open disbelief. Ethan's expression softened into concern. Julian narrowed his eyes with even greater interest than before. Adrian stepped closer until only a few feet separated us. His voice remained calm, almost gentle. "This is the second time today that you knew something before anyone else." He studied my face for another quiet moment before asking the question I had been dreading since waking in this world. "Logan, what exactly are you trying so hard to protect us from?" The question lingered between us long after the library had returned to silence. Adrian did not sound suspicious. He sounded concerned, and somehow that was much harder to survive. I looked from one familiar face to another and realized every answer I could possibly give would only make things worse. "I am not protecting anyone," I said as calmly as I could. "I just noticed strange things." Julian studied me for another moment before closing the floating spell book beside him. "People who simply notice strange things do not predict magical disturbances down to the second," he replied. "Either your instincts are extraordinary, or someone has told you secrets they should not know." I wished it were either of those options. The truth was somehow even less believable. Before the conversation could continue, a clear voice echoed through the library entrance. "There you all are." Every head turned. Claire Bennett stepped inside, carrying a stack of academy papers against one hip. Even after reading the novel years ago, I had forgotten how effortlessly she drew attention. Without trying, her expression brightened when she saw Adrian and the others, But the smile faltered for the smallest fraction of a second when her eyes landed on me. It was not dislike. It looked more like surprise. "Professor Rowan has been looking for all of you," Claire said. "There is an emergency faculty meeting about the magical disturbances." Ethan nodded immediately. Mason stretched his shoulders with an easy grin, while Julian quietly tucked his notes beneath one arm. Adrian remained where he was for one heartbeat longer before finally stepping back. "This conversation is not finished," he said softly. I forced another smile. "I had a feeling you were going to say that." To my relief, all four heroes followed Claire toward the library doors. I counted to 10 after they disappeared before letting my shoulders relax. "Congratulations," I muttered to myself. "You successfully avoided becoming the center of attention by becoming the center of attention." It was possibly the worst achievement of my life. I should have returned to my dorm immediately. Instead, curiosity betrayed me again. The strange blue book still rested on the reading table where I had left it. I opened the cover, half expecting blank pages. This time silver letters appeared almost instantly. "The heroine has begun to awaken. The story rejects its original path. The anchor must choose." I stared at the words until another line slowly formed beneath them. "Seek the Hall of Echoes before the second moon." The ink dissolved into empty parchment before I could read anything else. "Interesting." Claire's voice came quietly from behind me. I nearly dropped the book. She stood alone at the end of the aisle, her papers gone, her expression thoughtful rather than cheerful. "You can see it too, can you not?" she asked. My heartbeat stumbled. "See what?" She looked down at the open pages. "The writing that disappears." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The library felt impossibly still, as though every enchanted clock had forgotten how to measure time. Claire finally smiled, but there was sadness hiding behind it. "I thought I was the only one," she admitted. "Ever since this morning, pieces of the world have felt wrong. People remember conversations that never happened. Dreams feel more real than yesterday. And when I looked at you, I had the strangest feeling that we were both standing somewhere we were never supposed to reach." The silver scar across my throat grew cold again. Before I could answer, every candle in the library flickered once in perfect unison. Somewhere far above the academy, a deep bell rang only a single time. Claire slowly lifted her eyes toward the ceiling and whispered, almost to herself, "It has started sooner than I feared. The story is rewriting itself while we are still inside it." Claire did not wait for my response. She simply closed the strange blue book with careful hands, almost as if she were afraid it might begin speaking again. "Not here," she whispered. "Too many ears. Too many eyes." Before I could ask what she meant, the heavy library doors opened once more. Students poured back inside, laughing about the earlier magical disturbance as though it had already become another entertaining academy rumor. The quiet moment disappeared instantly. Claire gave me one last meaningful look before blending naturally into the crowd. If I had blinked, I might have believed the conversation had never happened at all. I remained frozen beside the reading table, staring at the ordinary blue cover. 5 minutes ago, I thought I was the only person carrying memories that did not belong. Now Claire could see disappearing words. The heroes remembered impossible dreams. The world itself was rewriting events months ahead of schedule. I had wanted to avoid the story. Instead, it felt like the story had begun chasing me. The walk back to my dorm should have taken 10 minutes. Somehow it lasted almost an hour because my brain insisted on replaying every conversation from the day. Adrian had looked at me with concern instead of suspicion. Ethan believed he had already lost me once. Mason felt as though we had trained together before. Julian was already treating me like the center of an unsolved mystery. Claire knew about the hidden messages. None of this had happened in the original novel. Wonderful. I sighed while climbing the stone staircase. I broke reality before making any friends. Even the enchanted portraits hanging along the hallway seemed unusually interested in me. One elderly wizard inside a golden frame lowered his newspaper and quietly nodded as I passed. "Good luck," he said. "You are going to need it." I stopped walking. "Excuse me." The portrait blinked twice. "What are you talking about?" The old wizard frowned in genuine confusion. "I only asked whether you were lost." I stared at him for several long seconds before continuing down the hall. Either the portraits were developing an unfortunate sense of humor, or reality had become even stranger than I realized. My room looked exactly as I had left it that morning. Sunlight faded across the floor. A gentle breeze moved the curtains. For one glorious minute, everything felt almost normal. Then I noticed an envelope resting neatly on my desk. There was no seal, no sender, only my name written in elegant silver ink. Logan Reed. I was absolutely certain it had not been there before. This is how every terrible decision starts, I muttered. Naturally, I opened it anyway. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting matched the mysterious words from the blue book. Do not trust the timeline you remember. It has already changed. Meet me at the Hall of Echoes before tomorrow's sunset. Come alone. Burn this message after reading. I looked around the empty room. Who are you? I asked the silence. Nobody answered. The paper suddenly dissolved into tiny silver particles that drifted upward like glowing snow before disappearing completely. No ashes. No evidence. Nothing remained except a faint scent of cedar and rain. My heart sank because I recognized that scent immediately. It was the same quiet fragrance that lingered whenever Adrian Vale walked past. Before I could make sense of that impossible connection, someone knocked gently on my dormitory door. 3 slow taps. Calm. Patient. Familiar. I opened the door expecting to find Adrian standing there. Instead, the hallway was empty. No students. No professors. No footsteps. Only one object rested on the wooden floor outside my room. It was my Silver Academy crest, the one Adrian had returned to me that morning. Except someone had carved 4 tiny stars into the back, symbols that had never been there before, and beneath them, in impossibly neat handwriting, were 6 words that turned my blood cold. We remember more than you think. Sleep and I reached a mutual agreement that night. It refused to visit, and I stopped pretending I expected it to. The Silver Academy crest rested on my desk beneath the moonlight, the 4 tiny stars catching the pale glow every time I glanced toward the window. We remember more than you think. Those 6 words repeated inside my head until they no longer sounded like a warning. They sounded like a promise. I finally lay down sometime after midnight, fully dressed, because somehow that felt like a reasonable life choice now. When morning arrived, the academy buzzed with nervous excitement. Professors spoke in hushed voices. Upperclassmen traded theories about the magical disturbances. Even the enchanted fountains in the central courtyard seemed quieter than usual, their crystal water flowing in slow, thoughtful circles instead of playful spirals. I blended into the crowd with my books held close, determined to survive one ordinary day. Naturally, destiny laughed at that plan. The moment I reached the dining hall, Mason Cole waved enthusiastically from across the room. Logan. His voice carried far better than anyone should reasonably allow before breakfast. Half the students turned toward me. Over here. There is an empty seat. I briefly considered pretending my name had suddenly become Benjamin. Unfortunately, Mason had already started walking toward me with the unstoppable confidence of someone who had never doubted a decision in his life. You skipped breakfast yesterday, he said with an easy grin. You should eat today. I blinked. How do you know I skipped breakfast yesterday? Mason opened his mouth, then stopped. His smile faded into confusion. He rubbed the back of his neck. Actually, I do not know. His brow furrowed. I just knew. Before either of us could untangle that impossible statement, Ethan appeared carrying 2 warm pastries and a cup of tea. I thought you might like these, he said with his usual gentle smile. I do not know why, but every time I see cinnamon rolls, I think of you. I stared at the pastry as though it contained the answers to the universe. In the original novel, Ethan did not even know Logan's favorite drink, let alone what he liked for breakfast. Thank you, I managed. That is very kind. It feels familiar, Ethan admitted quietly. Like I have done this before. A shadow crossed the table. Adrian placed a tray beside mine with calm precision before sitting across from me. He did not interrupt. He did not ask another difficult question. Instead, he simply slid a small plate toward me. Fresh strawberries. The exact fruit Logan had secretly loved according to a bonus chapter that most readers had probably forgotten. My heartbeat stumbled. Adrian noticed my expression and spoke in his usual steady voice. Something told me you would prefer those instead of apples. He looked genuinely puzzled by his own words. I cannot explain why. Around us, conversations continued as normal, but our table felt strangely separate from the rest of the dining hall, as though invisible walls had quietly formed around the 4 of us. Then Julian arrived carrying 3 ancient scrolls beneath one arm. He did not sit. He unfolded the top scroll across the table and looked directly at Adrian. I searched the restricted archives before sunrise, he said. There are records describing groups who shared memories across different timelines. The room suddenly felt much colder. Julian's finger rested on a faded illustration of 4 stars surrounding a single unnamed figure. According to these records, he continued softly, whenever history begins rewriting itself, the heroes always remember one person first. They call that person the anchor. His blue eyes slowly lifted until they met mine. Logan, he said, almost reluctantly. I believe that person is you. The word anchor echoed through my thoughts long after the breakfast crowd dissolved into ordinary conversations again. Julian quietly rolled up the ancient scroll while Ethan looked at me with open concern, Mason with determined loyalty, and Adrian with the same calm expression that somehow carried more emotion than anyone else's. I should have denied everything. I should have laughed and walked away before the story tightened its grip even further. Instead, I found myself asking the one question I had been afraid to hear answered. What happens to the anchor? Julian hesitated. For the first time since I had met him, he looked uncertain. The records are incomplete, he admitted. Most of the pages were damaged centuries ago, but every surviving account repeats one detail. His fingers rested lightly against the old parchment. The anchor changes history, and history always tries to reclaim what was taken from it. An uncomfortable silence settled over the table. Even Mason had stopped smiling. Before anyone could speak again, the academy bells rang across the campus, signaling the beginning of afternoon classes. Students hurried through the courtyards, unaware that my entire understanding of this world had quietly fallen apart over breakfast. Adrian stood first. Walk with me, he said. It was not an order. It was a simple request, somehow that made it impossible to refuse. We crossed the academy gardens beneath tall white trees whose crystal leaves shimmered softly in the afternoon sun. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The peaceful silence felt strangely comfortable instead of awkward. Finally, Adrian stopped beside a quiet fountain where silver fish drifted lazily beneath perfectly clear water. You have been afraid of me since the first moment we met, he said. His voice remained steady, without accusation or disappointment. Yet every decision you make seems intended to keep me safe. I stared at the ripples spreading across the fountain. Some people deserve protecting, I answered quietly. Adrian looked at me for a long moment before shaking his head. That is not what troubles me. He reached into the inner pocket of his uniform jacket and carefully unfolded a small piece of paper. This does. He handed it to me. It was a sketch. Simple pencil lines captured a familiar scene with startling accuracy. A young man stood in the center of a crowded square, while another raised a sword with quiet sorrow in his eyes. My hands began to tremble. I had never told anyone about the execution I remembered. Adrian watched my expression carefully. I found this drawing on my desk this morning, he said. I do not remember creating it. His gray eyes met mine. But when I looked at it, I knew 2 things with absolute certainty. His voice softened almost to a whisper. The man holding the sword was me. My breathing caught. Adrian continued before I could answer. And the person standing in front of me, his gaze never left my face, was you. The world seemed to hold its breath. The fountain stopped sounding like water. The breeze no longer moved the leaves above us. Every impossible memory, every strange dream, every rewritten page suddenly pointed toward the same terrifying truth. Adrian remembered the ending just as I did. Before either of us could speak another word, the academy sky flashed with brilliant silver light. Every student in the courtyard looked upward as enormous glowing letters slowly appeared across the clouds like words being written on the heavens themselves. The first sentence formed with impossible clarity, visible to everyone beneath the sky. The final revision has begun. Then, as thousands of stunned eyes watched in complete silence, a second line appeared beneath it, one that only I seemed able to read. Welcome back, Logan. This time, let us see whether love can change the ending.